First of all, I just want to thank you. I always say the these classes are amazing, and Lever and I get more out of them than you do because to me it's just so refreshing to see wave after wave of leaders, new leaders, kind of fresh idealism, and both he and I have been. I guess we met about 26 years ago. When
We were four
working-
years old. We were only 4 years old.
Yeah, so we were among the very, very few sort of minority staffers in the state Senate. I was working as Post Audit and Oversight Bureau Director for Senator Jakes, who was from Needham and represented, 10 or 12 communities out in the kind of western suburbs. And Leverett was one of the first people I met, and it was really that experience of feeling pretty isolated. And I always tell the story that I came from Texas, which is Texas considered a progressive state? No, Richard is saying no, so is Lee. But the thing that's amazing, I'm from Corpus Christi, which Corpus Christi, the majority minority community was even 25 years ago. And so, the mayor or the county judge or the county commissioners or, any number of positions, you just expected to see a, fair representation of the people in that community. And I remember still to this day, doing an orientation for new employees at the, of the Massachusetts legislature. And there were about 50, 60 people there. And it was me and Conrad Crawford. Some of you may know him. He works for, I think, the trustees of reservation now, but he used to work for Senator Diane Wilkerson. And we were the only non-white folks in that room. And, I'm sure, because it's a great line and never like to use it too, but Jared Barrios, my co-founder, used to say that the complexion of the State House changes at 5 p.m. when the staff and the legislators leave and the cleaning staff come in, right? So, then there's still an element of that. But if you told me that we'd have, Deval Patrick would be the, governor, and that we'd have kind of an expectation of diversity in the governor's staff, in the cabinet, in the legislative staff. Not that we're there, where we should be. But I think we're in a whole different day, right? Mayor Wu, that Diego works for. So none of that was true 25 years ago. Then you see, this is hard work. And I just get so much out of seeing, I wish we were in person. I prefer it in person, but I know it's more convenient for people in Zoom. But just that sort of refreshment of new blood, new energy, new idealism, and I cannot thank you more. And I always say, you guys are weirdos by definition, because there's lots of great shows on HBO and Netflix, and most people are like binge watching, whatever shows is hot. And you guys are spending your evening after probably days of Zoom calls doing a glorified civics lesson. So I celebrate your weirdness, and that is the only thing keeping Massachusetts and the United States working, is that people like you care enough, not just about yourselves, although there's no shame in caring about yourself and career, but also about your community and about the Commonwealth. And so thank you. And what I'm going to do today is just give you an overview of the legislative process. And it's going to be a flurry of stuff. You guys watched that cartoon, right? So honestly, like, that cartoon has about 80% right. And we're all going to throw a bunch of words at you that will seem confusing. You'll hear them over and over the course of the 6 weeks. But the main thing I learned, because we used to do surveys afterward, what you really need to come out of this seminar with is a feeling that you belong. Right? I remember a woman from Colombia who was a seminar participant, and she had lived here for 15 years, and she said, I didn't know you could come into this building, right? And the idea that that building is yours, that you belong, whether you're a citizen or not, you're a resident, etc., that is your building. I always say every single person who works in that building is paid for with your tax dollars, whether you're a citizen or not, right? You're paying meals tax, sales tax, income tax, any number of different sort of taxes, and everyone from the governor to the person cleaning after hours is on your payroll, right? So you don't need to go in as a supplicant. You're not going in as a beggar. You're going in as a stakeholder in that building. And if you leave the 6 weeks with that sort of in your gut, then we've been successful. The other thing, which is a lot harder doing it the way that we do now in terms of this Zoom stuff, is people always said the most important thing that they got out of the seminar was relationships, right? I mean, Diego told the story about how one relationship led to another, meeting me, and that ended up at MAPC, and you start a career track. So I don't know if you're doing any in-person sort of meetings, Leverett, but I would challenge you to like pick a couple of people that seem interesting on this call and have a cup of coffee, get lunch, because the thing is, as you probably know, again, you're weirdos. Your family might not understand what you do, or your friends might not understand why you're doing this. So, to find people who care about the same sorts of issues, who are willing to spend their time, energy, resources on this kind of thing, like that's the richness of this life, right? I mean, Leverett and I have had, I don't know, probably together 8 different jobs since we met 27 years ago. And it's not the jobs that matter, it's the relationships that matter. And, and hopefully you use this as a springboard to know a couple of people that you otherwise wouldn't meet, right? Because we tend to be in silos, we tend to be in, our ethnic communities, we tend to be in our issue areas. So I would challenge you, pick one person tonight and reach out to them and say, hey, can we get a cup of coffee? So anyway, so I'm going to give you a kind of whirlwind tour of how the legislature works in the next 45 minutes. So Leverett, you want to call up so go ahead, next slide. So I always ask this question of like, why did we fight the American Revolution? Somebody have an answer? And I would encourage you to take on. I'm from a big family, so I like noise, and so unless you got like a screaming child in the back or honking cars, turn off that, because I want this to be interactive and people to jump in. Anybody hazard a guess why we fought the American Revolution?
And also, since I'm sharing screen, I can't see people raising their hands. Unfortunately, Diego, you might be able to see folks, and Joel.
Yeah, I'll do that, or I'll cold call people too. So
yeah, and I can't see my
you
chat
warned.
either. So
all right,
Well,
Clyde,
I
go for
I
it.
would say people don't need to like raise their hand. Just jump on in.
Clyde, go for it.
I would say there's a mix of factors. I feel like the way that we learn it in school is mainly that the colonies felt like the British were taxing them with their representation, and then there are a series of laws like the Intolerable Acts, Tea Acts, and then British soldiers kind of laying siege in Boston, things like that. So like this kind of reaction was building over the 1760s and 1770s that led to skirmishes, and then eventually we had the first battles of the American Revolution.
Well, I used to always give every class a sort of a moniker, like it would be the best looking class, etc. I might end up having to call this the most intelligent class, because usually people like stab around for 5 or 6 times before somebody gets the right answer. But so Clive, good job. The sort of that taxation without representation. Next slide. That arbitrary. Next slide, Lever. So this is King George III, who was the King of England, right? And at least the sort of interpretation of the American Revolution is that we fought against sort of arbitrary power to be imposed upon us, right? There was taxation, and I would say that the most important piece is without representation. So the American colonists had no say in what was happening to them. So this idea of arbitrary power is really important because what I'm going to describe is a diffusion of power, which you will, or maybe you already do, find frustrating. But it's important to understand why that system was set up. Next slide. The process is intended to be hard. No arbitrary power. There's a separation of power. Next slide. And these are, and so instead of like one person making decisions on behalf of all of us, we separated powers. What are these three symbols? Anybody?
The branches,
The branches of government. What are the three branches of government?
legislative, executive, and judicial.
Exactly. So, instead of one body that does everything, the legislature legislates, so makes the laws. The executive branch executes the laws, and then judicial branch interprets the laws, right? So we split up power. And not only did we split up power into these three branches, but the legislature is made up of what? Massachusetts. Is it one legislature? No one?
House and Senate.
The House and the Senate, right? So, beyond just the three branches, we split up the legislative branch to have a lower house, the House, and then the Senate, somewhat modeled on the House of Lords and the House of Commons, but different. And then even the executive branch here in Massachusetts, we're so distrustful of power. In some cases, they have strong governors. But here, the executive branch is split up too, right? Because there's the governor. And does the attorney general work for the governor? No, right? It's a separately elected person. The treasurer is separately elected. The auditor is separately elected. And so you have the secretary of state is separately elected. So that's the fundamental thing, is because we were in reaction to, too much concentrated power. We blew it apart. Next slide. So we'll talk about the Massachusetts legislature. So we'll talk a little bit about the executive branch and judicial, but this class is mostly around the legislative process. So here's how that looks. The bicameral legislature, which means two houses, the House of Representatives, 160 members, approximately 45,000 people per district, and the state Senate, which is 40 members, approximately 180,000 people per district. And that creates a certain dynamics, right? Because the House, a House member might represent just a neighborhood in Boston or a small community in kind of Metro West or whatnot. Whereas the state Senate often has more diverse interests, where it might be a piece of Boston and 5 suburbs, or it might be 12 suburban communities, or it might be 40 rural communities. So there's a whole different kind of set of priorities for each one of those. And then one governor who represents everyone. And then I always like to say constituents come first. Does anybody know what a constituent is?
It's us.
Yes, it's us, but it's a particular us, right? When I used to work, I started working in the state Senate for a senator. And we used to have a rule. This was way back in the day when emails were rare. But if somebody called, we called them back that day. If they were from the district, meaning when they lived within the area, we'd call them back that day. If they wrote an email, we would write them back that day. And if they wrote a letter, we'd send a letter within a week. If that person was did not live in the district, we had a totally separate time frame for them because we basically threw those letters away, right? Somebody, I think David put voters, and I would be a little broader than that because, I think voters, people, legislators tend to know who the super voters are, who comes out for elections and that sort of thing. But you can also, even if you are not registered to vote or not a citizen, you can still find ways to influence because you can hold signs, you can call the office, you can, demonstrate, but, people are highly sensitive to, what people in the district that they represent. Because, the weird thing is you don't think necessarily of legislators as people, but that's, they are people. And, just imagine that most of you probably have jobs. If your job, every 2 years, somebody could say, hey, I want his job, and goes around the office and badmouths you and says, oh, he was late for work this 10 times and, he's not responsive, etc. So that's the experience that the legislators have. Now, they mostly don't have a lot of contest for that, but they live in fear because their livelihood and their ego are on the line because you're either, I always call this a brass ring business. Like you're either in charge of the world or you're not, right? My state senator, she was, very important. And then she went and took a job that didn't work out. And then all of a sudden, nobody needs you anymore. So a lot is at stake. Next slide. So the way, there's 200 people, right? It's hard for me. I'm married. I don't know how many of you are married, but it's very hard to make decisions even with one other person around, the color of the kitchen wall. So if you can imagine 200 people, all who are driven, have big egos, have ambitions, and instead of the color of the wall, they're deciding, should we kill people in the name of the state? Should we reform the police departments? Should we allow non-traditional people to marry? So these big, existential questions, and you have 200 people. So you have to organize 200 people. And the way that's organized is there's like king and queens of the hill, right? The speaker and the Senate president, they have a lot of power. They're the ones who name leadership. They assign what committees you're on. They give you office assignments. They set the floor agenda, authorize staff hires, salary increases, office furniture, etc. So part of the dynamics you got to understand is these people are supremely important during that time. But they get elected, right? So typically, people tend to stay on for quite a while. You may have seen the Senate president, she had the Ways and Means chair get rid of her term limits. There were, I think, 8-year term limits to be Senate president. So like every decade or so, typically they change leadership, and that gets to be intensely personal sort of voting, because the 160 members in the Senate, and it's the Democrats, right? I should say we're an overwhelmingly Democratic state. I think there's probably around 35 Republicans right now out of 200 members. But they elect the speaker and the Senate president. And once they elect them, and I think they're actually, maybe even today or tomorrow, I think I saw that they're beginning to lay out who's going to be on the committee assignments, right? So if you get elected, like you work your ass off, got elected, you care about education, and you ask to be on the education committee, like you could either be on that education committee and work on the thing you're passionate about, or you might get put on, federal financial aid committee and whatnot. Or you might get to be a committee chair, which means you get 20 grand more than everybody else, and you get a nice office, and you get 6 staff instead of having 1 staff. All of that is decided by the Senate president.
And Joel, sorry to interrupt. We have a question from He1, or she has her hand up, I should say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Joel. So, I mean, that's enormous amounts of power, right? Because depending on the committee assignments, that's extra pay for people who get those assignments. And also not having term limits. I was disappointed to see Senate go backwards and get rid of term limits for the president. And not all states do it this way, right? Because there are some states who, like committee assignments, it's voted on rather than assigned. So it just, to me, in Massachusetts, the speaker and the Senate presidents just have unlimited amount of power. I watched DeLeo transition to Mariano, and the timing of it was such that, you know, no other candidate was really possible in that time frame. So all those are, you know, not true elections. So
Yeah, I would say that was a rare situation where somebody basically was able to hand the baton to their partner.
yeah,
You know, I mean, the way the Senate president became Senate president was through scandal, right? The previous Senate president, you know, their partner had sexually harassed people, and it became a big scandal, and he stepped aside. They announced a temporary Senate president, and then they actually had a vote, and because it was, you know, an open election, nobody got enough votes to get the majority. And so they said, well, this other Senate president is going to stay through the end of the term. But then Karen Spilka lined up enough votes to say, I have the majority. And so she actually pushed out the acting secretary like 4 days before the session. And, I've been around for like 27 years. I mean, not that the scandal was certainly newsworthy and salacious, but more often than not, they're open elections. So I would say it's maybe the only experience where somebody managed to just completely hand it to the next person. So some of those committee assignments, the ones that get paid more, a lot of them are substance committees, so it might be healthcare, finance, education, higher education. Sometimes they're process committees. So that might be bills in third reading. That has its own powers, right? Because you become a sort of gatekeeper of what moves forward or not. Although all mostly controlled by the speaker and the Senate president. And some committees are joint committees. Most of the substance committees are joint committees, and most of the process committees are just within their own branch. Next slide. And Diego, I can't see when people raise hands or make comments. So
Yeah, I'll flag them for you.
okay. So there's one committee that's more special than all of the other committees, which is the Ways and Means Committee. That's the Budget Committee, and this is an old deck. So I think the budget now is probably approaching $60 billion. Is that right, Diego?
Yeah, it's like 56.
Yeah. So it's a lot of money. Some of it is from the feds, but I always like to quote Speaker Sam Rayburn from the U.S. House, where he'd say, "All politics is in the budget; everything else is poetry." And there's a certain kernel of truth to that, because I wasn't in the introductions, but a lot of the things that you guys care about, if you're caring about childcare, if you're caring about education, if you're caring about gang violence, if you're caring about English language learning, whatever it is that your key issues are, most of them have to do with spending money. And that Ways and Means Committee decides where the money is spent. Again, they're branch committees, because So the House and the Senate. So what you're about to see, and actually the timing of this is really nice, Leverett. On March 1, the governor is going to present her budget to the legislature. So you guys might use that as an opportunity to kind of follow that bill. So she presents it on March 1. It goes over to the House. The House by, I believe it's April, right after April vacation, votes their version of the budget, which could look very, very different than what the governor proposed. And then it goes over to the Senate. And they spent a few weeks looking at the budget. And then they come out with their own version, I think in early May, is that right, Gil? And so now we have 3 budgets, right? The governor's budget is no longer relevant, although it creates the foundation of what, what she proposes. So she may propose tax cuts, or she may propose, things that she wants to do. The House could choose to ignore that and do something else. Senate would do something else. And then all of a sudden, so what do you do to reconcile the 2 budgets from both branches? Again, talking about the diffusion of power. But there's also the other thing is somebody's got to make the decision, right? So the conference committee and the Ways and Means chairs, sort of in the back, and of course in the background is the Speaker and the Senate President. So there's 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate. By tradition and by rule, that's 2 Democrats and 1 Republican. And they sit in a room and they hash out, and this, the budget is, I don't know, probably 300 pages long. All these kind of line items, there's also a lot of like pet issues. And they have to go through all of that. And then by June, come out with a budget that they send to the governor. It's also worth noting that there are outside sections because it's really hard to pass a law. So people try to take advantage of the budget because every year we have to pass the budget, and they stick pieces of legislation in the budget, sort of trying to short circuit the legislative process. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not, but people try to push that through because it's a bill that has to go through.
And Hewan, did you have another question?
I did, sorry.
Hey, no apologies. I love that.
So, there are like 6,000 bills filed at the State House at the beginning of the legislative session. And most of them, like, you may have a hearing, but they don't even come out until next year sometime. And they extend the date and they come out even later sometimes. But it sounds like there are a certain set of bills that actually gets rolled into the budget and are those a specific type of bills, or is it anything that the legislature want to pass earlier?
Well, a lot of the outside sections are sort of technical in nature. They might fix a budgetary issue, or there's some court case that is not controversial. But in the old days, and I don't know, Diego, I paid less attention to like just general stuff than I used to. But like in the old days, they used to stick on big bills. And like I care about immigration issues, and way back when, and it's weird because back then, for a while the House was conservative and the Senate was considered liberal. Back in the day, I remember a time that we'd occasionally go through these hysterias about immigration, and there was like a hysteria about immigration at the time, and the Senate. Like in the middle of the night with no process, because that's a danger of like the budget, right? Because you can hide things in this 300-page bill. But they put in all this like really egregious anti-immigrant language in the Senate bill. So there are occasions where stuff like that happens. Diego, can I ask you, because you're again pay attention. What are examples of recently of outside sections?
Yeah, so the past few budgets, and the past few includes like COVID, they've tried to limit the policy items that they attach to budgets. But the it's funny because I always like to joke in the legislature, there's rules, and then there's the rules the legislature makes for themselves, right? So all these rules of things that can happen and don't happen until it does. And so an example that I'll give is this isn't a budget item, but for using the city of Boston as an example, the city of Boston and Mayor Wu have asked to have a seat at the MBTA board of directors, which we currently do not have. Last year, we were able to get it in the budget. It didn't make it into the final version of the bill, but that's an example where it's not a money issue, but it's a policy item that we were able to include in the budget. But I think overall in the past few budgets, they've limited the amount of policies that they've added to it. And some of that is because during COVID, they try to be very narrow
I would say there's
kind of what
also a
they propose.
difference. The legislature is a 2-year cycle. And like, we're just starting the new branch. They haven't even named the committees. So this year, everything's just getting going. There's gonna be less pressure to try to put outside sections into the budget. Whereas next year, we're coming to the close of the budget. And if you don't pass your bill, it goes back to square one, the next legislative session. So there's a lot more desperation next year as we're getting close to the end of the session than there is this year. That's just another dynamic. Next slide. So one of the key takeaways is this last bullet, which is don't underestimate relationships with staff. Because everybody wants to legislators, governor, etc. But the people that make the building work are the sort of underpaid, overworked legislative staff who, if you send them a letter, probably not the senator is reading that letter, it's the staff person is reading the letter. If you are trying to get them to co-sponsor an amendment, the way it actually happens is, the staff will read it. Back when I was a staffer, we generate a list and say, we think we should, we encourage you to be co-sponsors on the following bills or the following amendments. And, the ultimate decision maker is the legislator, but the staff are the ones who do the work, the people who write the bill, etc. So one of the big mistakes that people make, sorry, I heard an echo for a second. Is they just are dismissive of staff, or if you get offered to meet with staff, I've actually had people say, "Oh, I'd have to meet with you." I'm like, well, when it comes time to recommend, what amendments, if you have been really ungracious to staff members, do you think you're more likely or less likely to be successful? So, the Jewish, Jewish Community Relations Council, I don't know if they still do it, but they were really smart because a lot of people give legislative awards to legislators, but they used to give legislative awards to legislative aides. And, that just, it's pretty rare. And, honestly, if you're giving an award to the legislative aide, nine times out of 10, the legislator actually comes because they want to be supportive of their staff people, right? So actually really smart, but do not underestimate that. Next slide. So we'll go through quickly. So we just started the session. A bill is filed. This should say January because they changed the deadline now. The bills are filed in January. They're assigned to a committee. If you file a bill on time, by rule, every bill will have a hearing. So many of you might have been to a bill hearing. Anybody who's been to one? Can you describe what that was like?
I went to one on rent stabilization. Wait, sorry.
No, it was at the state level, Clive.
Oh, state level?
Transfer fee. It was a transfer fee.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Yes, transfer fee. Yes, I went to one on the transfer fee for City of Boston last June. Um, sorry.
And what did you see there?
It was we had excuse me. People testifying on the transfer fee, and then you had the legislators kind of doing like a hearing where like they bring people to testify on certain things and ask them questions, and they like have a statement.
Yeah, so if you're trying to get so if somebody said there's 6,000 bills, and there are probably 7,000, 7,500 bills, and only a couple of hundred of them major, significant bills will actually become law in any one session, right? So your chances of becoming a law are slim. So what do you do to increase the chances, right? So some of the things you do are, one, be competent in drafting it. Two, figure out what is a coalition that makes this easier to say yes than to say no. Three, get as many co-sponsors as you can and get them engaged. When there's a hearing, you go and we used to have hundreds of people go to it and support it, and then you have to be rabid in sort of pushing that issue. And the press is really important. I think you'll have a session on the press, but whatever you're reading about right now, the legislature wants to be responsive to, right? If inflation is the big issue, they're going to figure out a way to do it. If climate change is the big issue in the papers, they're going to try to figure out what, how can we be responsive to this? So it goes to that. There's three actions the committee can have. They can report favorably, they can report unfavorably, and they can place into study. And I would say some bills stay in committee for with no action, but most bills get moved along. But what is the worst thing of those three things that can happen? Richard,
Study.
Probably placed in the study. I think I think once they go to study it, then we about it. That's never gonna happen.
Yeah. So I always say bills are like sharks. They gotta keep moving or they die. So putting it into a study basically says we're freezing it, we're holding it here, and that's not what you want, because you want the bill to keep on moving. And actually, it's even better sometimes to have. It's pretty rare to be reported on unfavorably, because that basically means the committee let it go to the next step. So I remember a time when we were working on gun control issues, and the Senate president wanted to do assault weapons ban, but the committee chair was against gun control. And so the deal that was worked out with that committee chair was, hey, if you want to tell your constituents that you're against this, report it out unfavorably. And then when it came to the floor, because again, the Senate president or the speaker have so much power, there was a motion to overturn the committee's report. And then that committee report was done. Again, the bill has to keep moving. It's like a shark. So, if it comes out of the substance committee, usually, even if it spends $1, it goes to the Ways and Means Committee. So I would say, if you want to find like where is the graveyard for bills, the Ways and Committee is it, right? Because again, there's 6,000 bills. A lot of them will come out of committee. They'll go to the Ways and Means Committee in whichever branch, and then it never leaves there, right? You got to keep moving, right? So again, the committee chair together with the Senate president or the speaker, their leadership team, decide what do we need to do. And again, the press stuff and the public stuff matter a lot, because if there's a school shooting or something like that, then all of a sudden there's pressure to do something on that. The next page.
Joel, before you move on, could I ask a question?
Of course.
So everybody was scrambling, all the legislators, to file their bill by a deadline. I think it was like January 20th.
Yeah.
And then they also told me, well, I can file it late. So
Go ahead.
is there any penalty for filing late? Because
There is a penalty for filing late, potentially. Because every bill that's filed on time is required to get a committee hearing. So there's an extra step that's added where I think the whole legislature has to admit a bill that's filed late. And so if somebody wants to be opposed to it or delays it or it's a momentum, you could end up losing 6 months, 9 months, maybe forever. So it's better to be on time, but it's not impossible that a bill starts, at the end and goes. And the governor can file anytime. They have different rules for the governor. Great. So it goes, let's say there's interest in the bill. The Senate Ways and Means Committee wants to put it out. They can redraft the bill. And then they put it to a committee vote. And then at that point, and this is when a lot of people pay attention to bills because they don't wait, because they're like, oh my God, there's momentum behind this bill. So there's a flurry of amendments to that bill. And then it goes to the floor. And there are votes on each one of those amendments to pass or oppose. Sometimes they consolidate, sometimes there's a back room. Usually, again, the staff makes a lot of decisions because let's say we're talking about the budget, there might be 900 amendments to the bill. The staff stay all weekend and they put things in a yes, no pile. And again, they show it to the Senate President and the Speaker, but that general counsel has so much influence because it requires a lot for the Senate President to say, no, this thing in the no pile, let's put it in the yes pile or whatnot. So things can change in the Ways and Means Committee, and then they can change again when it goes to the floor. Then there's the first sort of big public vote on one branch, which is a vote called engrossment. And here's the thing, again, why do only 200-300 bills pass when there's 6,000 that are proposed? It gets passed by that branch. It goes to the other branch. They kind of go through the similar but truncated process. It usually gets assigned to the Ways and Means Committee. That Ways and Means Committee could amend it. If they move it forward, they'll put it to the floor. There can be further amendments. And it's almost impossible that a complex bill would come out of the House and the Senate in one way, right? So they then like we talked about the conference committee, next slide. If they have different versions, which they almost always do, there's either a conference committee or sometimes there's informal negotiations to resolve the differences in that. So again, that's a kind of more of a closed door process among 6 people with the influence of Senate President or the Speaker. And then it goes back for another full vote, what's called an enactment vote of both the House and the Senate. So it has to be voted on by both sides twice to be certain that it goes to the governor. And when the legislation goes to the governor, that's still not the end of the process. The governor can say, great, I love this thing, sign it into law, let's have a ceremony and everybody can hug each other and say we did a great thing. Occasionally something could be allowed to become law by just not signing it, but not returning it. So I remember Deval Patrick one time on a bill that the business community hated, but the labor community loved, which was to be able to sue companies for triple damages for any sort of wage violations. And Governor Patrick didn't sign it into law, but we allowed it to become law. This was a, he was trying to be in the middle there. Or the governor can veto it, which means I reject this and send it back to the House and the Senate, starting with whatever branch originated it. Or the governor, she can propose an amendment, and that sends it back to the legislature. The legislature has to, both branches vote on it, and decide, well, we're just gonna ignore you and send it back, or we're gonna amend it, or the House could amend it one way, and the Senate could amend it a different way, and they kind of go through the process again. And then even if the governor vetoes it, if the legislature has overwhelming support to make that a law, even if the governor chooses to say that that's a terrible idea, the legislature can still make it a law by passing it by a 2/3 vote. A good example of that is the driver's license bill, which has been around for a long time. It is driver's licenses for undocumented folks. And, people have been trying for 15 years to pass that. This year, to his credit, Speaker Mariano took the initiative and said, hey, we want to pass this. They rounded up the votes, and they passed it with an overwhelming margin, although I don't think it was, I forget if it was 2/3 vote on the first vote or not. Governor Baker, vetoed that. He sent it back and they overrode the veto. But, we don't normally talk about this. That still wasn't the end of the deal, because we have a right in our Constitution to, put things directly to the ballot, right? So the people who oppose the driver's license for undocumented folks actually collected, I don't know, 100,000 signatures or whatever was required. And they put it to the ballot to get rid of that law. And, I was very pleased to see that the people voted to keep the bill. It was a close vote. I think it was 53 to 47% or something like that. But it just tells you how long something can happen. And, the only thing I'll say, I usually say this, is you might feel frustrated if you're, say, a supporter of the undocumented license bill. Sometimes that hurts you. Sometimes it helps you how difficult the process is, because there are certain moments where, again, it's very responsive to public pressure. If we had a unicameral legislature back when they proposed all those anti-immigration things, that would have become law, right? So, sometimes you benefit from the fact that we distrust power in America and in Massachusetts, and sometimes it's frustrating. But it's, you could throw up your hands and say, why the hell do I want to be involved with this? Every single thing you might care about, whether it's life and death, or marriage, or education, or assisted suicide, all of those decisions are decided in that building. So you can choose to say, nah, not for me, but you're basically choosing to say, I'm not going to be involved. This Leverett, who's making this chat comment?
It's Leverett.
Yeah, I mean, because how we've drawn the parallel between the process on the federal level and the state level. I mean, how many times from 2016 to 2020 were we grateful that the process moved slowly, and that the executive's unilateral, or the executive branch, in that case being the president, wasn't able to move unilaterally. So I'm agreeing with you, Joel, that sometimes you're on the giving end, sometimes you're on the receiving end. But looking back from in terms of the federal government or presidency and in Congress, I mean, there were plenty of times where I was thinking, oh, thank goodness that we don't have a monarch or somebody who can just move things quickly. So I was echoing your sentiments, but on the federal level.
Yeah, in the feds, they actually have in the Senate, what do they call it? The 60 vote, what's that called, Diego?
Filibuster.
Yeah, they have a special rule in the Senate that says you need 60 votes to pass, any bill if somebody motions to filibuster. So that keeps, and then that actually goes back, I think, to sort of civil rights and the Southern senators and sort of a drag on stuff. But again, they can help you or hurt you. And something, and things change, and the public changes, right? If you had told me that we would be able to pass with 60 plus votes in the Senate, gay marriage codification, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I would have totally been disbelieving that, right? Next slide. So, I would say, there's always exceptions to the rule, and there's a lot of process when everything comes together. Again, there's exceptions to every rule. I remember the Senate president when he was running, this is Tom Birmingham, when he was running for governor. He wanted to pass the assault. What was it? I forget what bill it was, but like the whole thing took two weeks to pass because he made it his top priority and probably traded something with the House to accomplish that. Last slide. I think the last slide. So I would say these are my lessons to you. Constituents come first, but the people who are in the district matter because again, their lives and livelihoods, and we go down the line. Start early to succeed. Tom Birmingham used to say, it's not necessarily rich or poor, it's the organized versus the unorganized. And the organized, are in a much better position vis-a-vis the legislature. Be accurate and concise, know your bill numbers, keep it brief. I always say, understand like what is the ask here, right? I mean, when I work in the legislature, sometimes people would come and give me 200-page documents and say, want to bring this problem to your attention. Like that's not helpful to me. Like if you're saying, hey, would the senator consider co-sponsoring this bill, and here's a 1-page fact sheet of what it does, and here's a place where you can find more information, and what we're asking you to do is co-sponsor or to co-sign a letter or something like that. So like, be clear. I always say solve a problem, don't create a problem. Like, I remember somebody from the prostate cancer came in and talked to me about, the issues with prostate cancer. I'm like, well, that's fine, but like, I'm not gonna go, spend 2 years researching that. Come to me with like, okay, well, we want the health insurance benefits to include, prostate screenings. Like that's a concrete, specific, action that you're asking the state to do. I would say trust is everything. Like I've had people lie to me or represent me, and I mean to me, like I'm done with you forever because once you lose your credibility, you have no place in this. In my opinion, you have no space available in this round. Don't disrespect the staff. We talked about that. Thank you goes a long way. I'll tell you. And the younger folks are not particularly good at it. Thank you notes, appreciation, particularly appreciation of staff. You'd be amazed at how much that helps. Similarly, recognition works. If you've ever been in a legislator's office, every single one has a picture with a wall of pictures with prominent people, the president, the Senate president, etc. You don't run for the legislature unless you have an ego. And if somebody is the me wall, yes, let's love it, yes. And I have a me wall, and nothing wrong with having an ego. But I remember one time with a senator when I was at MAPC, we made her legislator of the year. And I remember like 2 weeks later, she called, she's like, you guys need anything in the budget? Right? So I think just that building of relationship matters. Media is dominant on people's minds. And if you're gonna be in this business, build long-term relationships. Because, because your calls will get returned. And there is an end to this process. This is the governor giving me the pen that he signed the Uber and Lyft law with, because I was the chief author of that. Where I worked with our lawyers and I was the lead person on it. But there is an end, and if you are driven over and over and over and over again, we've made progress. Whether it's gay rights, whether it's immigration, whether it's education reform, whether it's union issues, whether it's a minimum wage. It takes work. Sometimes it takes years of work, but you can be successful. I'll end there, and if people have any questions, happy to answer. But we'll keep you on time.
Joel, and Ginny, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question. And then, so we'll go Ginny and then we'll go Gloria.
Yeah, I think I typed it in the chat, but I was just curious on how useful the 2/3 override is. And I guess like on a practical level, does it have more cons or does it have more pros? Or what is that?
Well, I think it's designed as a fail safe again, because you don't want too much power concentrated in one person's hand. And here in Massachusetts, it's different because 80% of the legislature is Democrats. So on something like the budget, because in budget issues, the governor has line item vetoes. And so like if you follow the budget process, which I encourage you to do this year, the timing of it is nice here. Almost certainly the governor will issue 100 vetoes of specific line items, and probably 60 of them will be overturned. So it's a pretty routine thing on like the budget. And but it's hard, typically the House and the Senate are fighting because they just have different institutional interests. So I mean the governor is more powerful than the legislature, but they can overrule. Jessica, on the other hand.
So we'll go Gloria, he won. If it's okay, we're gonna go Gloria, Jessica, and then he won.
Thanks, Diego. Thank you so much, Joel, for this really thorough walkthrough of the process. This is a very logistical question, but I guess I'm wondering, just given the complexity and iterative nature of how a bill passes through, I'm wondering if you have recommendations about how to just tactically follow a bill that you're interested in. Obviously I've been on the Massachusetts legislature website, but have definitely found that sometimes it's really complicated to actually figure out what's going on and where in that arc a bill that I'm interested in actually is.
Yeah, so I think you can go to the website and you can see a bill, and it has the bill history and it has the text of every version of that bill, and so you should be able to see what was. And I think fact sheets are generally there as well, although they may or may not be that helpful. I would say if you're interested in a bill, give me an example of something you're interested in. Can you give an example, Gloria? You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So TOPA, for example, was something that I was following. The Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which I think has been brought up multiple times in various sessions and hasn't been passed.
Yeah, so I would say, it's very hard for an individual to follow, a lot of, you can, but I would say, generally speaking, ally with a particular organization, because there's probably an organization or multiple pushing that. And, if you get on the newsletter, or if you work for MAPC, we used to be famous for putting out bill summaries. Like I was deeply involved in municipal health insurance reform, which was very complicated. And, you know, every time a different version came out, our lawyer would put together a really nice table saying, here was the original proposal, here was the House proposal, here was the Senate proposal, you know, any interpretation. And we used to actually share that. Sometimes, you know, and actually we got a lot of credit because we shared it with, you know, both sides, and, you know, we're fair in sharing it because people craving that kind of information. So I would say find the organization that has the capacity to follow, because somebody's following it in a deep way.
Thank you.
Diego, I'll let you facilitate.
All right, Jessica, and then he won. And others, feel free to put in the chat or raise your hand.
Hi, Joel. Thank you so much for the presentation and the additional information. My name is Jessica Aspeda. I own a family childcare program in East Cambridge. A lot of the advocacy I do is obviously for early education, childcare. So what I heard is, you know, constituents, and I'm wondering, as a constituent who is actively advocating for budgeting change, what is that process? So right now, early education and care is not on an annual budget. We've gotten and received federal funding because of COVID-19. So once the federal funding depletes completely, we're going to be back in the same situation. The Department of Secondary Ed has its own budget and gets funding annually, but the early education sector continues to be underrepresented, underfunded, underbudgeted. And I'm wondering, because of the change in regards to leadership and their own incentives and what they focus, like how do we make change in regards to budgets that are already set? Like the education budget is usually set. It's only like change in regards to what is needed. But if we do need to add additional funding, is that state level? Is that federal funding? Like what direction should I go in?
Well, it's probably both. Again, the same advice to Gloria, as I figure out who are the sort of champions in this space that you're allied with, and get on their newsletters. You might even consider, it seems like you're very passionate. They probably have like legislative committees, advisory committees, that sort of thing. So you might think about, you know, that sort of involvement. I don't know a whole lot about the early ed space. I know I hear Senate President Spilka talking that issue up a lot, and I've heard, you know, the governor talking that up a lot. You know, I would say the thing that would be on my mind is that we did pass this, you know, millionaire's tax that's supposed to go to education and transportation. They'll be deciding what the uses of that are. You know, the issue I think with early childhood, I have I was involved a little bit minorly when I was in the Gov's office, because education was not my area. But you know, you're competing. The schools are highly organized. The universities are highly organized. The Mass Teachers Association basically, you know, bankroll the sort of the election, and you know, early child care centers, you know, just much less organized than either of those sectors, right? So, you know, I think, but the fact is we're in crisis there. I got a grandson, and you know, I know how hard it is to even just get spaces and what the labor issues are, et cetera. So I think it is an area of intense focus. I don't know, Diego or others, if you know particular things you would point Jessica to.
I'll try to be quick because I wanted to get Huon's question, and I know we'll hit wrap up by 7:15. But yeah, like, so the one bill for you, Jessica, I don't know if it's on your radar. It's called the Common Start Bill, and I believe like that is one of the major bills on early ed and education that seems to be like a good basis of what the conversation will be going forward. I think one of the many, like, they have a website, but one of the groups that I know is spearheading that is the Massachusetts Business Roundtable. And so to Joel's point, take a look at the Common Start Coalition. I think I'm pretty sure that's what it's called. And within that page, you'll see like all of its members. Like, take a look at those organizations and see if there's newsletters or different ways to get involved with those. But I'm happy to chat more offline. But I think that's a good starting point.
I'm definitely going to connect with you, Diego. Thank you.
I'm not an expert, so I just you're warned. So he wanted for a last quick question, and then I know Leverett's pinging me about wrapping up soon.
Okay, so I'll be quick. I've noticed that I've been asking my legislators to co-sponsor important bills, and I've noticed that sometimes the House reps will co-sponsor Senate bills and vice versa, even though they are exactly the same. Or some legislators will co-sponsor both, even though they're exactly the same. So is there any meaning behind that?
Well, I mean, there's a strategy like to who, strategy and ego to who files what bills, right? The main difference is if it's a House bill and it's filed with the House and the first name on the bill is a House member, it goes to a committee. Generally, those are joint committees, and when it comes out of committees, it'll go to the House, right? And so some people will say, hey, that play or some, I don't know why somebody would want to. I mean, I guess the reason somebody would file the same bill with two is either the ego of the House and the Senator both want their name at the very top, and you want to give you a chance to go to either branch, and I think there's a certain amount of, hey, I mean, legislators are very press driven. There's a lot less press than there used to be, but you want to be able to say if something passes, hey, I co-sponsored that bill, right?
Okay, thank you, Joel, for everything.
Oh, no worries.